Chapter 16 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne, Chapter 16. The Southern Hemisphere. The projectile had just escaped a terrible danger, and a very unforeseen one. Who would have thought of such an encounter with meteors? These erring bodies might create serious perils for the travellers. They were to them so many sandbanks upon that sea of ether, which, less fortunate than sailors, they could not escape. But did these adventurers complain of space? No, not since nature had given them the splendid sight of a cosmical meteor bursting from expansion, since this inimitable firework, which no Greate could imitate, had lit up for some seconds the invisible glory of the moon. In that flash, continents, seas, and forests had become visible to them. Did an atmosphere, then, bring to this unknown face its life-giving atoms? Questions still insoluble, and forever closed against human curiosity. It was then 3:30 in the afternoon. The projectile was following its curvilinear direction around the moon. Had its course again been altered by the meteor? It was to be feared so, but the projectile must describe a curve unalterably determined by the laws of mechanical reasoning. Barbicane was inclined to believe that this curve would be rather a parabola than a hyperbola. But, admitting the parabola, the projectile must quickly have passed through the cone of shadow projected into space opposite the sun. This cone, indeed, is very narrow, the angular diameter of the moon being so little when compared with the diameter of the orb of day, and up to this time the projectile had been floating in this deep shadow. Whatever had been its speed, and it could not have been insignificant, its period of occultation continued. That was evident, but perhaps that would not have been the case in a supposedly rigid parabolical trajectory, a new problem which tormented Barbicane's brain, imprisoned as he was in a circle of unknowns which he could not unravel. Neither of the travellers thought of taking an instant's repose. Each one watched for an unexpected fact, which might throw some new light on their uranographic studies. About 5 o'clock, Nicholl and Ardan distributed under the name of dinner some pieces of bread and cold meat, which were quickly swallowed without either of them abandoning their scuttle, the glass of which was incessantly encrusted by the condensation of vapour. About 45 minutes past 5 in the evening, Nicholl, armed with his glass, sighted toward the southern border of the moon, and in the direction followed by the projectile, some bright points cut upon the dark shield of the sky. They looked like a succession of sharp points, lengthened into a tremulous line. They were very bright. Such appeared the terminal line of the moon when in one of her octants. They could not be mistaken. It was no longer a simple meteor. This luminous ridge had neither colour nor motion, nor was it a volcano in eruption, and Barbicane did not hesitate to pronounce upon it. "The sun!" he exclaimed. "What, the sun?" answered Nicholl and Nicholl and Ardan. "Yes, my friends, it is the radiant orb itself, lighting up the summit of the mountains situated on the southern borders of the moon. We are evidently nearing the South Pole." "After having passed the North Pole," replied Michel, "we have made the circuit of our satellite, then?" "Yes, my good Michel." "Then no more hyperbolas, no more parabolas, no more open curves to fear." "No, but a closed curve." "Which is called?" "An ellipse. Instead of losing itself in interplanetary space, it is probable that the projectile will describe an elliptical orbit around the moon." "Indeed." "And that it will become her satellite." "Moon of the moon!" cried Nicholl and Ardan. "Only I would have you observe, my worthy friend," replied Barbicane, "that we are none the less lost for that." "Yes, in another manner, and much more pleasantly," answered the careless Frenchman, with his most amiable smile. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 17. Tycho. At 6 in the evening the projectile passed the South Pole at less than 40 miles off, a distance equal to that already reached at the North Pole. The elliptical curve was being rigidly carried out. At this moment the travellers once more entered the blessed rays of the sun. They saw once more those stars which move slowly from east to west. The radiant orb was saluted by a triple hurrah. With its light it also sent heat, which soon pierced the metal walls. The glass resumed its accustomed appearance. The layers of ice melted as if by enchantment, and immediately, for economy's sake, the gas was put out, the air apparatus alone consuming its usual quantity. "Ah," said Nicholl, "these rays of heat are good. With what impatience must the Selenite wait the reappearance of the orb of day!" "Yes," replied Nicholl and Ardan, "imbibing, as it were, the brilliant ether, light and heat. All life is contained in them." At this moment the bottom of the projectile deviated somewhat from the lunar surface in order to follow the slightly lengthened elliptical orbit. From this point, had the earth been at the full, Barbicane and his companions could have seen it, but immersed in the sun's irradiation, she was quite invisible. Another spectacle attracted their attention, that of the southern part of the moon, brought by glasses to within 450 yards. They did not again leave the scuttles, and noted every detail of this fantastical continent. Mounts Durefol and Leibnitz formed two separate groups very near the South Pole. The first group extended from the pole to the 84th parallel on the eastern part of the orb. The second occupied the eastern border, extending from the 65 degree of latitude to the pole. On their capriciously formed ridge appeared dazzling sheets, as mentioned by Père Secchi. With more certainty than the illustrious Roman astronomer, Barbicane was enabled to recognize their nature. "They are snow!" he exclaimed. "Snow?" repeated Nicholl. "Yes, Nicholl, snow, the surface of which is deeply frozen. See how they reflect the luminous rays. Cooled lava would never give out such intense reflection. There must then be water. There must be air on the moon. As little as you please, but the fact can no longer be contested." No, it could not be. And if ever Barbicane should see the earth again, his notes will bear witness to this great fact in his selenographic observations. These mountains, Durefol and Leibnitz, rose in the midst of plains of a medium extent, which were bounded by an indefinite succession of circles and annular ramparts. These two chains are the only ones met with in this region of circles. Comparatively but slightly marked, they throw up here and there some sharp points, the highest summit of which attains an altitude of 24,600 feet. But the projectile was high above all this landscape, and the projections disappeared in the intense brilliancy of the disk. And to the eyes of the travellers there reappeared that original aspect of the lunar landscapes, raw in tone, without gradation of colours, and without degrees of shadow, roughly black and white, from the want of diffusion of light. But the sight of this desolate world did not fail to captivate them by its very strangeness. They were moving over this region as if they had been borne on the breath of some storm, watching heights defile under their feet, piercing the cavities with their eyes, going down into the rifts, climbing the ramparts, sounding these mysterious holes, and leveling all cracks. But no trace of vegetation, no appearance of cities, nothing but stratification, beds of lava, overflowings polished like immense rivers, reflecting the sun's rays with overpowering brilliancy. Nothing belonging to a living world, everything to a dead world, where avalanches, rolling from the summits of the mountains, would disperse noiselessly at the bottom of the abyss, retaining the motion but wanting the sound. In any case, it was the image of death, without its being possible even to say that life had ever existed there. Michel Ardan, however, thought he recognized a heap of ruins, to which he drew Barbicane's attention. It was about the 80th parallel in 30 degrees longitude. This heap of stones, rather regularly placed, represented a vast fortress, overlooking a long rift, which in former days had served as a bed to the rivers of prehistorical times. Not far from that rose to a height of 17,400 feet the annular mountain of Short, equal to the Asiatic Caucasus. Michel Ardan, with his accustomed ardour, maintained the evidences of his fortress. Beneath it he discerned the dismantled ramparts of a town, here the still intact arch of a portico, there 2 or 3 columns lying under their base. Further on, a succession of arches which must have supported the conduit of an aqueduct. In another part, the sunken pillars of a gigantic bridge, run into the thickest parts of the rift. He distinguished all this, but with so much imagination in his glance, and through glasses so fantastical, that we must mistrust his observation. But who could affirm, who would dare to say, that the amiable fellow did not really see that which his 2 companions would not see? Moments were too precious to be sacrificed in idle discussion. The Selenite city, whether imaginary or not, had already disappeared afar off. The distance of the projectile from the lunar disk was on the increase, and the details of the soil were being lost in a confused jumble. The reliefs, the circles, the craters, and the plains alone remained, and still showed their boundary lines distinctly. At this moment, to the left lay extended one of the finest circles of lunar orography, one of the curiosities of this continent. It was Newton, which Barbicane recognized without trouble, by referring to the Mappa Selenographica. Newton is situated in exactly 77 degrees south latitude and 16 degrees east longitude. It forms an annular crater, the ramparts of which, rising to a height of 21,300 feet, seem to be impassable. Barbicane made his companions observe that the height of this mountain above the surrounding plain was far from equaling the depth of its crater. This enormous hole was beyond all measurement, and formed a gloomy abyss, the bottom of which the sun's rays could never reach. There, according to Humboldt, reigns utter darkness, which the light of the sun and the earth cannot break. Mythologists could well have made it the mouth of hell. Newton, said Barbicane, is the most perfect type of these annular mountains, of which the earth possesses no sample. They prove that the moon's formation, by means of cooling, is due to violent causes. For while, under the pressure of internal fires, the reliefs rise to considerable height, the depths withdraw far below the lunar level. I do not dispute the fact, replied Michel Ardan. Some minutes after passing Newton, the projectile directly overlooked the annular mountains of Moret. It skirted at some distance the summit of Blancanus, and at about 7:30 in the evening reached the circle of Clavius. This circle, one of the most remarkable of the disk, is situated in 58 degrees south latitude and 15 degrees east longitude. Its height is estimated at 22,950 feet. The travelers, at a distance of 24 miles, reduced to 4 by their glasses, could admire this vast crater in its entirety. Terrestrial volcanoes, said Barbicane, are but molehills compared to those of the moon. Measuring the old craters formed by the first eruptions of Vesuvius and Etna, we find them little more than 3 miles in breadth. In France, the circles of the Cantal measure 6 miles across. At Ceyland, the circles of the island is 40 miles, which is considered the largest on the globe. What are these diameters against that of Clavius, which we overlook at this moment?" "What is its breadth?" asked Nicholl. "It is 150 miles," replied Barbicane. "This circle is certainly the most important on the moon, but many others measure 150, 100, or 75 miles." "Ah, my friends!" exclaimed Michel, "can you picture to yourselves what this now peaceful orb of night must have been when its craters, filled with thunderings, vomited at the same time smoke and tongues of flame? What a wonderful spectacle then, and now what decay! This moon is nothing more than a thin carcass of fireworks, whose squibs, rockets, serpents, and suns, after a superb brilliancy, have left but sadly broken cases. Who can say the cause, the reason, the motive force of these cataclysms?" Barbicane was not listening to Michel Ardan. He was contemplating these ramparts of Clavius, formed by large mountains spread over several miles. At the bottom of the immense cavity burrowed hundreds of small extinguished craters, riddling the soil like a colander, and overlooked by a peak 15,000 feet high. Around the plain appeared desolate. Nothing so arid as these reliefs, nothing so sad as these ruins of mountains, and, if we may so express ourselves, these fragments of peaks and mountains which strewed the soil. The satellite seemed to have burst at this spot. The projectile was still advancing, and this movement did not subside. Circles, craters, and uprooted mountains succeeded each other incessantly. No more plains, no more seas, a never-ending Switzerland and Norway, and lastly, in the canter of this region of crevices, the most splendid mountain on the lunar disk, the dazzling Tycho, in which posterity will ever preserve the name of the illustrious Danish astronomer. In observing the full moon in a cloudless sky, no one has failed to remark this brilliant point of the southern hemisphere. Michel Ardan used every metaphor that his imagination could supply to designate it by. To him this Tycho was a focus of light, a center of irradiation, a crater vomiting rays. It was the tire of a brilliant wheel, an asteroid enclosing the disk with its silver tentacles, an enormous eye filled with flames, a glory carved for Pluto's head, a star launched by the Creator's hand and crushed against the face of the moon. Tycho forms such a concentration of light that the inhabitants of the earth can see it without glasses, though at a distance of 240,000 miles. Imagine, then, its intensity to the eye of observers placed at a distance of only 50 miles. Seen through this pure ether, its brilliancy was so intolerable that Barbicane and his friends were obliged to blacken their glasses with the gas smoke before they could bear the splendor. Then, silent, scarcely uttering an interjection of admiration, they gazed, they contemplated. All their feelings, all their impressions were concentrated in that look, as under any violent emotion, all life is concentrated at the heart. Tycho belongs to the system of radiating mountains, like Aristarchus and Copernicus, but it is of all the most complete and decided, showing unquestionably the frightful volcanic action to which the formation of the moon is due. Tycho is situated in 43 degrees south latitude and 12 degrees east longitude. Its center is occupied by a crater 50 miles broad. It assumes a slightly elliptical form and is surrounded by an enclosure of annular ramparts, which on the east and west overlook the outer plain from a height of 15,000 feet. It is a group of Mont Blancs placed round one common center and crowned by radiating beams. What this incomparable mountain really is, with all the projections converging towards it and the interior excrescences of its crater, photography itself could never represent. Indeed, it is during the full moon that Tycho is seen in all its splendor. Then all shadows disappear, the foreshortening of perspective disappears, and all proofs become white, a disagreeable fact. For this strange region would have been marvellous if reproduced with photographic exactness. It is but a group of hollows, craters, circles, a network of crests, then, as far as the eye could see, a whole volcanic network cast upon this encrusted soil. One can then understand that the bubbles of this central eruption have kept their first form. Crystallized by cooling, they have stereotyped that aspect which the moon formerly presented when under the Plutonian forces. The distance which separated the travellers from the annular summits of Tycho was not so great, but that they could not catch the principal details. Even on the causeway forming the fortifications of Tycho, the mountains hanging onto the interior and exterior sloping flanks rose in stories like gigantic terraces. They appeared to be higher by 300 or 400 feet to the west than to the east. No system of terrestrial encampment could equal these natural fortifications. A town built at the bottom of this circular cavity would have been utterly inaccessible and wonderfully extended over this soil covered with picturesque projections. Indeed, nature had not left the bottom of this crater flat and empty. It possessed its own peculiar orography, a mountainous system, making it a world in itself. The travellers could distinguish clearly cones, central hills, remarkable positions of the soil, naturally placed to receive the chef d'oeuvre of Selenite architecture. There was marked out the place for a temple, here the ground of a forum, on this spot the plan of a palace, in another the plateau for a citadel, the whole overlooked by a central mountain of 1,500 feet, a vast circle in which the ancient Rome could have been held in its entirety 10 times over. "Ah!" exclaimed Michel Ardan, enthusiastic at the sight. "What a grand town might be constructed within that ring of mountains, a quiet city, a peaceful refuge beyond all human misery. How calm and isolated those misanthropes, those haters of humanity, might live there, and all those who have a distaste for social life." "All, it would be too small for them," replied Barbicane simply. End of chapter 17.
Of chapter 18, Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Around the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 18, Grave Questions. But the projectile had passed the enceinte of Tycho, and Barbicane and his 2 companions watched with scrupulous attention the brilliant rays which the celebrated mountain shed so curiously over the horizon. What was this radiant glory? What geological phenomenon had designed these ardent beams? This question occupied Barbicane's mind. Under his eyes ran, in all directions, luminous furrows, raised at the edges and concave in the center, some 12 miles, others 30 miles broad. These brilliant trains extended in some places to within 600 miles of Tycho, and seemed to cover, particularly toward the east, the northeast, and the north, the half of the southern hemisphere. One of these jets extended as far as the circle of Neander, situated on the 40th meridian. Another, by a slight curve, furrowed the Sea of Nectar, breaking against the chain of Pyrenees after a circuit of 800 miles. Others, toward the west, covered the Sea of Clouds and the Sea of Humors with a luminous network. What was the origin of these sparkling rays, which shone on the plains as well as on the reliefs, at whatever height they may be? All started from a common center, the crater of Tycho. They sprang from him. Herschel attributed their brilliancy to currents of lava congealed by the cold, an opinion, however, which has not been generally adopted. Other astronomers have seen in these inexplicable rays a kind of moraines, rows of erratic blocks, which had been thrown up at the period of Tycho's formation. "And why not?" asked Nicholl of Barbicane, who was relating and rejecting these different opinions. "Because the regularity of these luminous lines and the violence necessary to carry volcanic matter to such distances is inexplicable." "Huh? By Jove," replied Michel Ardan, "it seems easy enough for me to explain the origin of these rays." "Indeed," said Barbicane. "Indeed," continued Michel, "it is enough to say that it is a vast star, similar to that produced by a ball or a stone thrown at a square of glass." "Well," replied Barbicane, smiling, "and what hand would be powerful enough to throw a ball to give such a shock as that?" "The hand is not necessary," answered Nicholl, not at all confounded. "And as to the stone, let us suppose it to be a comet." "Ah, those much-abused comets!" exclaimed Barbicane. "My brave Michel, your explanation is not bad, but your comet is useless. The shock which produced that rent must have come from inside the star. A violent contraction of the lunar crust while cooling might suffice to imprint this gigantic star." "A contraction, something like a lunar stomachache?" said Michel Ardan. "Besides," added Barbicane, "this opinion is that of an English savant, Nasmyth, and seems to me to sufficiently explain the radiation of these mountains." "That Nasmyth was no fool," replied Michel. Long did the travelers, whom such a sight could never weary, admire the splendors of Tycho. Their projectile, saturated with luminous gleams in the double irradiation of sun and moon, must have appeared like an incandescent globe. They passed suddenly from excessive cold to intense heat. Nature was thus preparing them to become Selenites. Become Selenites. That idea brought up once more the question of the habitability of the moon. After what they had seen, could the travelers solve it? Would they decide for or against it? Michel Ardan persuaded his two friends to form an opinion and asked them directly if they thought that men and animals were represented in the lunar world. "I think that we can answer," said Barbicane, "but according to my idea, the question ought not to be put in that form. I ask it to be put differently." "Put it your own way," replied Michel. "Here it is," continued Barbicane. "The problem is a double one and requires a double solution. Is the moon habitable? Has the moon ever been inhabitable?" "Good," replied Nicholl. "First, let us see whether the moon is habitable." "To tell the truth, I know nothing about it," answered Michel. "And I answer in the negative," continued Barbicane. "In her actual state, with her surrounding atmosphere certainly very much reduced, her seas for the most part dried up, her insufficient supply of water restricted, vegetation, sudden alternations of cold and heat, her days and nights of 354 hours, the moon does not seem habitable to me, nor does she seem propitious to animal development, nor sufficient for the wants of existence as we understand it." "Agreed," replied Nicholl. "But is not the moon habitable for creatures differently organized from ourselves?" "That question is more difficult to answer, but I will try. And I ask Nicholl if motion appears to him to be a necessary result of what life, whatever be its organization." "Without a doubt," answered Nicholl. "Then, my worthy companion, I would answer that we have observed the lunar continent at a distance of 500 yards at most, and that nothing seemed to us to move on the moon's surface. The presence of any kind of life would have been betrayed by its attendant marks, such as divers buildings, and even by ruins. And what have we seen? Everywhere and always the geological works of nature, never the work of man. If, then, there exist representatives of the animal kingdom on the moon, they must have fled to those unfathomable cavities which the eye cannot reach, which I cannot admit, for they must have left traces of their passage on those plains which the atmosphere must cover, however slightly raised it may be. These traces are nowhere visible. There remains but one hypothesis, that of a living race to which motion, which is life, is foreign. One might as well say living creatures which do not live, replied Michel. Just so, said Barbicane, which, for us, has no meaning. Then we may form our opinion, said Michel. Yes, replied Nicholl. Very well, continued Nicholl and Ardan. The scientific commission assembled in the projectile of the gun club, after having founded their argument on facts recently observed, decide unanimously upon the question of the habitability of the moon. No, the moon is not habitable. The decision was consigned by President Barbicane to his notebook, where the process of the sitting of the 6th of December may be seen. Now, said Nicholl, let us attack the second question, an indispensable complement of the first. I ask the Honorable Commission, if the moon is not habitable, has she ever been inhabited? Citizen Barbicane? My friends, replied Barbicane, I did not undertake this journey in order to form an opinion on the past habitability of our satellite, but I will add that our personal observations only confirm me in this opinion. I believe, indeed I affirm, that the moon has been inhabited by a human race organized like our own. She has produced animals anatomically formed like the terrestrial animals. But I add that these races, human and animal, have had their day and are now forever extinct. Then, asked Michael, the moon must be older than the Earth? No, said Barbicane decidedly, but a world which has grown old quicker and whose formation and deformation have been more rapid. Relatively, the organizing force of matter has been much more violent in the interior of the moon than in the interior of the terrestrial globe. The actual state of this cracked, twisted, and burst disk abundantly proves this. The moon and the earth were nothing but gaseous masses originally. These gases have passed into a liquid state under different influences, and the solid masses have been formed later. But most certainly, our sphere was still gaseous or liquid when the moon was solidified by cooling and had become habitable. I believe it, said Nicholl. Then, continued Barbicane, an atmosphere surrounded it. The waters contained within this gaseous envelope could not evaporate. Under the influence of air, water, light, solar heat, and central heat, vegetation took possession of the continents, prepared to receive it, and certainly life showed itself about this period, for nature does not expend herself in vain, and a world so wonderfully formed for habitation must necessarily be inhabited. But, said Nicholl, many phenomena inherent to our satellite might cramp the expansion of the animal and vegetable kingdom. For example, its days and nights of 354 hours? At the terrestrial poles, they last 6 months, said Michel. An argument of little value, since the poles are not inhabited. Let us observe, my friends, continued Barbicane, that if in the actual state of the moon its long nights and long days created differences of temperature insupportable to organization, it was not so at the historical period of time. The atmosphere enveloped the disk with a fluid mantle. Vapor deposited itself in the shape of clouds. This natural screen tempered the ardor of the solar rays and retained the nocturnal radiation. Light, like heat, can diffuse itself in the air, hence an equality between the influences which no longer exists. Now that atmosphere has almost entirely disappeared, and now I'm going to astonish you. Astonish us, said Nicholl and Ardan. I firmly believe that at the period when the moon was inhabited, the nights and days did not last 354 hours. And why? Asked Nicholl quickly. Because, most probably, then the rotary motion of the moon upon her axis was not equal to her revolution, an equality which presents each part of her disk during 15 days to the action of the solar rays. Granted, replied Nicholl, but why should not these two motions have been equal, as they are really so? because that equality has only been determined by terrestrial attraction. And who can say that this attraction was powerful enough to alter the motion of the moon at that period when the Earth was still fluid? Just so, replied Nicholl. And who can say that the moon has always been a satellite of the Earth? And who can say, exclaimed Michel Ardan, that the moon did not exist before the Earth? Their imaginations carried them away into an indefinite field of hypothesis. Barbicane sought to restrain them. Those speculations are too high, said he, problems utterly insoluble. Let us not enter upon them. Let us only admit the insufficiency of the primordial attraction, and then, by the inequality of the two motions of rotation and revolution, the days and nights could have succeeded each other on the moon as they succeed each other on Earth. Besides, even without these conditions, life was possible. And so, asked Michel Ardan, humanity has disappeared from the moon? Yes, replied Barbicane, after having doubtless remained persistently for millions of centuries. By degrees, the atmosphere becoming rarefied, the disk becoming uninhabitable, as the terrestrial globe will one day become by cooling. By cooling? Certainly, replied Barbicane, as the internal fires became extinguished, and the incandescent matter concentrated itself, the lunar crust cooled. By degrees, the consequences of these phenomena showed themselves in the disappearance of organized beings, and by the disappearance of vegetation. Soon the atmosphere was rarefied, probably withdrawn by terrestrial attraction, then aerial departure of respirable air, and disappearance of water by means of evaporation. At this period, the moon, becoming uninhabitable, was no longer inhabited. It was a dead world, such as we see today. And you say that the same fate is in store for the Earth? Most probably. But when? When the cooling of the crust shall have made it uninhabitable. And have they calculated the time which our unfortunate sphere will take to cool? Certainly. And you know these calculations perfectly. But speak then, my clumsy savant, exclaimed Michel Ardan, for you make me boil with impatience. Very well, my good Michel, replied Barbicane quietly. We know what diminution of temperature the Earth undergoes in the lapse of a century, and according to certain calculations, this mean temperature will, after a period of 400,000 years, be brought down to zero. 400,000 years, exclaimed Michel. I breathe again. Really, I was frightened to hear you. I imagined that we had not more than 50,000 years to live. Barbicane and Nicholl could not help laughing at their companion's uneasiness. Then Nicholl, who wished to end the discussion, put the second question, which had just been considered again. Has the moon been inhabited? He asked. The answer was unanimously in the affirmative. But during this discussion, fruitful in somewhat hazardous theories, the projectile was rapidly leaving the moon. The lineaments faded away from the traveler's eyes. Mountains were confused in the distance. And of all the wonderful, strange, and fantastical form of the Earth's satellite, there soon remained nothing but the imperishable remembrance. End of Chapter 18. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Read today by Webb Webster. www.webslog.com. Franklin, Tennessee, May 31st, 2007.
Chapter 19 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 19. A Struggle Against the Impossible. For a long time, Barbicane and his companions looked silently and sadly upon that world which they had only seen from a distance, as Moses saw the land of Canaan. and which they were leaving without a possibility of ever returning to it. The projectile's position with regard to the moon had altered, and the base was now turned to the earth. This change, which Barbicane verified, did not fail to surprise them. If the projectile was to gravitate round the satellite in an elliptical orbit, why was not its heaviest part turned toward it, as the moon turns hers to the earth? That was a difficult point. In watching the course of the projectile, they could see that on leaving the moon it followed a course analogous to that traced in approaching her. It was describing a very long ellipse, which would most likely extend to the point of equal attraction, where the influences of the earth and its satellite are neutralized. Such was the conclusion which Barbicane very justly drew from facts already observed, a conviction which his two friends shared with him. "And when arrived at this dead point, what will become of us?" asked Nicholl Ardan. "We don't know," replied Barbicane. "But one can draw some hypotheses, I suppose?" "Two," answered Barbicane. "Either the projectile's speed will be insufficient, and it will remain forever immovable on this line of double attraction." "I prefer the other hypothesis, whatever it may be," interrupted Nicholl. "Or," continued Barbicane, "its speed will be sufficient, and it will continue its elliptical course to gravitate forever around the orb of night." "A revolution not at all consoling," said Nicholl, "to pass to the state of humble servants to a moon whom we are accustomed to look upon as our own handmaid. So that is the fate in store for us?" Neither Barbicane nor Nicholl answered. "You do not answer," continued Nicholl impatiently. "There is nothing to answer," said Nicholl. "Is there nothing to try?" "No," answered Barbicane. "Do you pretend to fight against the impossible?" "Why not? Do one Frenchman and two Americans shrink from such a word?" "But what would you do?" "Subdue this motion which is bearing us away." "Subdue it?" "Yes," continued Nicholl, getting animated, "or else alter it and employ it to the accomplishment of our own ends." "And how?" "That is your affair. If artillerymen are not masters of their projectile, they are not artillerymen. If the projectile is to command the gunner, we had better ram the gunner into the gun. My faith, fine savants, who do not know what is to become of us after inducing me—" "Inducing you?" cried Barbicane and Nicholl. "Inducing you? What do you mean by that?" "No recrimination," said Nicholl. "I do not complain. The trip has pleased me, and the projectile agrees with me. But let us do all that is humanly possible to do the fall somewhere, even if only on the moon." "We ask no better, my worthy Nicholl," replied Barbicane, "but means fail us." "We cannot alter the motion of the projectile?" "No." "Nor diminish its speed?" "No." "Not even by lightening it, as they lighten an overloaded vessel?" "What would you throw out?" said Nicholl. "We have no ballast on board, and indeed it seems to me that if we lightened it would go much quicker." "Slower." "Quicker." "Neither slower nor quicker," said Barbicane, wishing to make his two friends agree, "for we float in space, and must no longer consider specific weight." "Very well," cried Nicholl Ardan in a decided voice. "Then there remains but one thing to do." "What is it?" asked Nicholl. "Breakfast," answered the cool, audacious Frenchman, who always brought up this solution at the most difficult juncture. In any case, if this operation had no influence on the projectile's course, it could at least be tried without inconvenience, and even with success from a stomachic point of view. Certainly Nicholl had none but good ideas. They breakfasted then at 2 in the morning. The hour mattered little. Nicholl served his usual repast, crowned by a glorious bottle drawn from his private cellar. If ideas did not crowd on their brains, we must despair of the Chambertin of 1853. The repast finished, observation began again. Around the projectile, at an invariable distance, were the objects which had been thrown out. Evidently, in its translatory motion round the moon, it had not passed through any atmosphere, for the specific weight of these different objects would have checked their relative speed. On the side of the terrestrial sphere, nothing was to be seen. The earth was but a day old, having been new the night before at 12, and 2 days must elapse before its crescent, freed from the solar rays, would serve as a clock to the Selenites, as in its rotary movement each of its points after 24 hours repasses the same lunar meridian. On the moon's side the sight was different. The orb shone in all her splendor amid innumerable constellations, whose purity could not be troubled by her rays. On the disk the plains were already returning to the dark tint which is seen from the earth. The other part of the nimbus remained brilliant, and in the midst of this general brilliancy Tycho shone prominently like a sun. Barbicane had no means of estimating the projectile's speed, but reasoning showed that it must uniformly decrease according to the laws of mechanical reasoning. Having admitted that the projectile was describing an orbit around the moon, this orbit must necessarily be elliptical. Science proves that it must be so. No motive body circulating round an attracting body fails in this law. Every orbit described in space is elliptical. And why should the projectile of a gun club escape this natural arrangement? In elliptical orbits, the attracting body always occupies one of the foci, so that at one moment the satellite is nearer, and at another farther from the orb around which it gravitates. When the Earth is nearest the Sun, she is in her perihelion, and in her aphelion at the farthest point. Speaking of the Moon, she is nearest to the Earth in her perigee, and farthest from it in her apogee. To use analogous expressions, with which the astronomer's language is enriched, if the projectile remains as a satellite of the Moon, we must say that it is in its aposelene at its farthest point, and in its periselene at its nearest. In the latter case, the projectile would attain its maximum of speed, and in the former its minimum. It was evidently moving toward its aposelenitical point, and Barbicane had reason to think that its speed would decrease up to this point, and then increase by degrees as it neared the Moon. This speed would even become nil if this point joined that of equal attraction. Barbicane studied the consequences of these different situations, and thinking what inference he could draw from them, when he was roughly disturbed by a cry from Nicholl and Ardan. "By Jove!" he exclaimed, "I must admit we are downright simpletons." "I do not say we are not," replied Barbicane, "but why?" "Because we have a very simple means of checking the speed which is bearing us from the Moon, and we do not use it." "And what is the means?" "To use the recoil contained in our rockets." "Done," said Nicholl. "We have not used this force yet," said Barbicane. "It is true, but we will do so." "When?" asked Nicholl. "When the time comes. Observe, my friends, that in the position occupied by the projectile, an oblique position with regard to the lunar disk, our rockets, in slightly altering its direction, might turn it from the Moon instead of drawing it nearer?" "Just so," replied Nicholl. "Let us wait, then. By some inexplicable influence, the projectile is turning its base toward the Earth. It is probable that at the point of equal attraction its conical cap will be directed rigidly toward the Moon. At that moment we may hope that its speed will be nil. Then will be the moment to act, and with the influence of our rockets we may perhaps provoke a fall directly on the surface of the lunar disk." "Bravo!" said Nicholl. "What we did not do, what we could not do on our first passage at the dead point, because the projectile was then endowed with too great a speed." "Very well reasoned," said Nicholl. "Let us wait patiently," continued Barbicane, "putting every chance on our side, and after having so much despaired, I may say I think we shall gain our end." This conclusion was a signal for Nicholl and Ardan's hips and hurrahs, and none of the audacious boobies remembered the question that they themselves had solved in the negative. No, the Moon is not inhabited. No, the Moon is probably not habitable. And yet they were going to try everything to reach her. One single question remained to be solved: at what precise moment the projectile would reach the point of equal attraction, on which the travelers must play their last card. In order to calculate this to within a few seconds, Barbicane had only to refer to his notes, and to reckon the different heights taken on the lunar parallels. Thus, the time necessary to travel over the distance between the dead point and the South Pole would be equal to the distance separating the North Pole from the dead point. The hours representing the time traveled over were very carefully noted, and the calculation was easy. Barbicane found that this point would be reached at 1 in the morning on the night of the 7th/8th of December, so that, if nothing interfered with its course, it would reach the given point in 22 hours. The rockets had primarily been placed to check the fall of the projectile upon the moon, and now they were going to employ them for a directly contrary purpose. In any case, they were ready, and they had only to wait for the moment to set fire to them. "Since there is nothing else to be done," said Nicholl, "I make a proposition." "What is it?" asked Barbicane. "I propose to go to sleep." "What a motion!" exclaimed Michel Ardan. "It is 40 hours since we closed our eyes," said Nicholl. "Some hours of sleep will restore our strength." "Never!" interrupted Michel. "Well," continued Nicholl, "everyone to his taste. I shall go to sleep." And, stretching himself on the divan, he soon snored like a 48-pounder. "That Nicholl has a good deal of sense," said Barbicane. "Presently I shall follow his example." Some moments after, his continued bass supported the captain's baritone. "Certainly," said Michel Ardan, finding himself alone, "these practical people have sometimes most inopportune ideas." And with his long legs stretched out, and his great arms folded under his head, Michel slept in his turn. But this sleep could be neither peaceful nor lasting. The minds of these three men were too much occupied, and some hours after, about 7 in the morning, all three were on foot at the same instant. The projectile was still leaving the moon and turning its conical point more and more toward her. An inexplicable phenomenon, but one which happily served Barbicane's ends. 17 hours more, and the moment for action would have arrived. The day seemed long. However bold the travelers might be, they were greatly impressed by the approach of that moment which would decide all, either precipitate their fall onto the moon, or forever chain them in an immutable orbit. They counted the hours as they passed too slow for their wish. Barbicane and Nicholl were obstinately plunged in their calculations, Michel going and coming between the narrow walls, and watching that impassive moon with a longing eye. At times recollections of the earth crossed their minds. They saw once more their friends of the Gun Club, and the dearest of all, J.T. Maston. At that moment the Honorable Secretary must be filling his post on the Rocky Mountains. If he could see the projectile through the glass of his gigantic telescope, what would he think? After seeing it disappear behind the moon's south pole, he would see them reappear by the north pole. They must therefore be a satellite of a satellite. Had J.T. Maston given this unexpected news to the world? Was this the denouement of this great enterprise? But the day passed without incident. The terrestrial midnight arrived. The 8th of December was beginning. 1 hour more and the point of equal attraction would be reached. What speed would then animate the projectile? They could not estimate it, but no error could vitiate Barbicane's calculations. At 1 in the morning this speed ought to be, and would be, nil. Besides, another phenomenon would mark the projectile's stopping point on the neutral line. At that spot the two attractions, lunar and terrestrial, would be annulled. Objects would weigh no more. This singular fact, which had surprised Barbicane and his companions so much in going, would be repeated on their return under the very same conditions. At this precise moment they must act. Already the projectile's conical top was sensibly turned toward the lunar disk, presented in such a way as to utilize the whole of the recoil produced by the pressure of the rocket apparatus. The chances were in favor of the travelers. If its speed was utterly annulled on this dead point, a decided movement toward the moon would suffice, however slight, to determine its fall. 5 minutes to 1, said Nicholl. All is ready, replied Michel Ardan, directing a lighted match to the flame of the gas. Wait, said Barbicane, holding his chronometer in his hand. At that moment, wait had no effect. The travelers felt in themselves the entire disappearance of it. They were very near the neutral point, if they did not touch it. 1 o'clock, said Barbicane. Michael Ardan applied the lighted match to a train in communication with the rockets. No detonation was heard in the inside, for there was no air. But through the scuttles Barbicane saw a prolonged smoke, the flames of which were immediately extinguished. The projectile sustained a certain shock which was sensibly felt in the interior. The three friends looked and listened without speaking, and scarcely breathing. One might have heard the beating of their hearts amid this perfect silence. "Are we falling?" asked Michael Ardan at length. "No," said Nicholl, "since the bottom of the projectile is not turning to the lunar disk." At this moment, Barbicane, quitting his scuttle, turned to his two companions. He was frightfully pale, his forehead wrinkled, and his lips contracted. "We are falling," said he. "Ah!" cried Michael Ardan. "On to the moon?" "On to the earth." "The devil!" exclaimed Michael Ardan, adding philosophically, "Well, when we came into this projectile, we were very doubtful as to the ease with which we should get out of it." And now this fearful fall had begun. The speed retained had borne the projectile beyond the dead point. The explosion of the rockets could not divert its course. This speed in going had carried it over the neutral line, and in returning had done the same thing. The laws of physics condemned it to pass through every point which it had already gone through. It was a terrible fall, from a height of 160,000 miles, and no springs to break it. According to the laws of gunnery, the projectile must strike the earth with a speed equal to that with which it left the mouth of the Columbiad, a speed of 16,000 yards in the last second. But to give some figures of comparison, it has been reckoned that an object thrown from the top of the towers of Notre Dame, the height of which is only 200 feet, will arrive on the pavement at a speed of 240 miles per hour. Here the projectile must strike the earth with a speed of 115,200 miles per hour. "We are lost," said Michael coolly. "Very well. If we die," answered Barbicane with a sort of religious enthusiasm, "the results of our travels will be magnificently spread. It is his own secret that God will tell us. In the other life the soul will want to know nothing, either of machines or engines. It will be identified with eternal wisdom." "In fact," interrupted Michael Ardan, "the whole of the other world may well console us for the loss of that inferior orb called the moon." Barbicane crossed his arms on his breast, with a motion of sublime resignation, saying at the same time, "The will of heaven be done." End of chapter 19. A Struggle Against the Impossible. Recording by Scott Robbins. Chapter 20. Of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 20. The Soundings of the Susquehanna. "Well, Lieutenant, and our soundings?" "I think, sir, that the operation is nearing its completion," replied Lieutenant Bronsfield. "But who would have thought of finding such a depth so near in shore, and only 200 miles from the American coast?" "Certainly, Bronsfield, there is a great depression," said Captain Blomsberry. "In this spot there is a submarine valley worn by Humboldt's current, which skirts the coast of America as far as the Straits of Magellan. These great depths," continued the lieutenant, "are not favorable for laying telegraphic cables. A level bottom like that supporting the American cable between Valentia and Newfoundland is much better." "I agree with you, Bronsfield. With your permission, Lieutenant, where are we now?" "Sir, at this moment we have 3,508 fathoms of line out, and the ball which draws the sounding lead has not yet touched the bottom, for if so, it would have come up of itself." "Brooks's apparatus is very ingenious," said Captain Blomsberry. It gives us very exact soundings." "Touch!" cried at this moment one of the men at the forewheel, who was superintending the operation. The captain and the lieutenant mounted the quarterdeck. "What depth have we?" asked the captain. 3,627 fathoms, replied the lieutenant, entering it in his notebook. "Well, Bronsfield," said the captain, "I will take down the result. Now haul in the sounding line. It will be the work of some hours. In that time the engineer can light the furnaces, and we shall be ready to start as soon as you have finished. It is 10 o'clock, and with your permission, Lieutenant, I will turn in." "Do so, sir, do so," replied the lieutenant obligingly. The captain of the Susquehanna, as brave a man as need be, and the humble servant of his officers, returned to his cabin, took a brandy grog, which earned for the steward no end of praise, and turned in, not without having complimented his servant upon making his beds, and slept a peaceful sleep. It was then 10 at night. The 11th day of the month of December was drawing to a close in a magnificent night. The Susquehanna, a corvette of 500 horsepower of the United States Navy, was occupied in taking soundings in the Pacific Ocean about 200 miles off the American coast, following that long peninsula which stretches down the coast of Mexico. The wind had dropped by degrees. There was no disturbance in the air. The pennant hung motionless from the main-topgallant mast truck. Captain Jonathan Blomsberry, cousin german of Colonel Blomsberry, one of the most ardent supporters of the gun club, who had married an aunt of the captain and daughter of an honorable Kentucky merchant, Captain Blomsberry could not have wished for finer weather in which to bring to a close his delicate operations of sounding. His corvette had not even felt the great tempest, which, by sweeping away the groups of clouds on the Rocky Mountains, had allowed them to observe the course of the famous projectile. Everything went well, and with all the fervor of a Presbyterian, he did not forget to thank heaven for it. The series of soundings taken by the Susquehanna had for its aim the finding of a favorable spot for the laying of a submarine cable to connect the Hawaiian Islands with the coast of America. It was a great undertaking, due to the instigation of a powerful company. Its managing director, the intelligent Cyrus Field, proposed even covering all the islands of Oceanica with a vast electrical network, an immense enterprise, and one worthy of American genius. To the corvette Susquehanna had been confided the first operations of sounding. It was on the night of the 11th-12th of December. She was in exactly 27 degrees 7 minutes north latitude, and 41 degrees 37 minutes west longitude, on the meridian of Washington. The moon, then in her last quarter, was beginning to rise above the horizon. After the departure of Captain Blomsberry, the lieutenant and some officers were standing together on the poop. On the appearance of the moon, their thoughts turned to that orb which the eyes of a whole hemisphere were contemplating. The best naval glasses could not have discovered the projectile wandering around its hemisphere, and yet all were pointed toward that brilliant disk which millions of eyes were looking at the same moment. "They've been gone 10 days, said Lieutenant Bronsfield at last. "What has become of them?" "They have arrived, Lieutenant," exclaimed a young midshipman, "and they are doing what all travelers do when they arrive in a new country, taking a walk." "Oh, I am sure of that if you tell me so, my young friend," said Lieutenant Bronsfield, smiling. "But," continued another officer, "their arrival cannot be doubted. The projectile was to reach the moon when full on the 5th at midnight. We are now at the 11th of December, which makes 6 days, and in 6 times 24 hours, without darkness, one would have time to settle comfortably. I fancy I see my brave countrymen encamped at the bottom of some valley on the borders of a selenite stream, near a projectile half buried by its fall amid volcanic rubbish, Captain Nicholl beginning his leveling operations, President Barbicane writing out his notes, and Nicholl and Ardan embalming the lunar solitudes with the perfume of his—" "Yes, yes, it must be so, it is so," exclaimed the young midshipman, worked up to a pitch of enthusiasm by this ideal description of his superior officer. "I should like to believe it," replied the lieutenant, who was quite unmoved. "Unfortunately, direct news from the lunar world is still wanting." "Beg pardon, Lieutenant," said the midshipman, "but cannot President Barbicane write?" A burst of laughter greeted this answer. "No letters," continued the young man quickly. "The postal administration has something to see to there." "Might it not be the telegraphic service that is at fault?" asked one of the officers ironically. "Not necessarily," replied the midshipman, not at all confused. "But it is very easy to set up a graphic communication with the earth." "And how?" "By means of the telescope at Long's Peak. You know, it brings the moon to within 4 miles of the Rocky Mountains, and that it shows objects on its surface of only 9 feet in diameter. Very well, let our industrious friends construct a giant alphabet, let them write words 3 fathoms long and sentences 3 miles long, and then they can send us news of themselves." The young midshipman, who had a certain amount of imagination, was loudly applauded. Lieutenant Bronsfield, allowing that the idea was possible, but observing that if by these means they could receive news from the lunar world, they could not send any from the terrestrial, unless the Selenites had instruments fit for taking distant observations at their disposal. "Evidently," said one of the officers. "But what has become of the travelers? What have they done? What have they seen? That, above all, must interest us. Besides, if the experiment has succeeded, which I do not doubt, they will try it again. The Columbiad is still stuck in the soil of Florida. It is now only a question of powder and shot, and every time the moon is at her zenith, a cargo of visitors may be sent to her." "It is clear," replied Lieutenant Bronsfield, "that J.T. Maston will one day join his friends." "If he will have me," cried the midshipman, "I am ready." "Oh, volunteers will not be wanting," answered Bronsfield, "and if it were allowed, half of the earth's inhabitants would emigrate to the moon." This conversation between the officers of the Susquehanna was kept up until nearly 1 in the morning. We cannot say what blundering systems were broached, what inconsistent theories advanced by these bold spirits. Since Barbicane's attempt, nothing seemed impossible to the Americans. They had already designed an expedition, not only of savants, but of a whole colony toward the Selenite borders, and a complete army consisting of infantry, artillery, and cavalry to conquer the lunar world. At 1 in the morning, the hauling in of the sounding line was not yet completed. 1,670 fathoms were still out, which would entail some hours' work. According to the commander's orders, the fires had been lighted, and steam was being got up. The Susquehanna could have started that very instant. At that moment, it was 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, Lieutenant Bronsfield was preparing to leave the watch and return to his cabin, when his attention was attracted by a distant hissing noise. His comrades and himself first thought that this hissing was caused by the letting off of steam, but, lifting their heads, they found that the noise was produced in the highest regions of the air. They had not time to question each other before the hissing became frightfully intense, and suddenly there appeared to their dazzled eyes an enormous meteor, ignited by the rapidity of its course and its friction through the atmospheric strata. This fiery mass grew larger to their eyes and fell with the noise of thunder upon the bowsprit, which it smashed close to the stem, and buried itself in the waves with a deafening roar. A few feet nearer, and the Susquehanna would have foundered with all on board. At this instant, Captain Blomsberry appeared, half-dressed, and rushing onto the forecastle deck, whither all the officers had hurried, exclaimed, "With your permission, gentlemen, what has happened?" And the midshipman, making himself as it were the echo of the body, cried, "Commander, it is they come back again!" End of Chapter 20. The Soundings of the Susquehanna. Recording by Scott Robbins.
Chapter 21 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. J.T. Maston recalled. "It is they come back again," the young midshipman had said, and everyone had understood him. No one doubted but that the meteor was the projectile of the gun club. As to the travellers which it enclosed, opinions were divided regarding their fate. "They are dead," said one. "They are alive," said another. "The crater is deep, and the shock was deadened." "But they must have wanted air," continued a third speaker. "They must have died of suffocation." "Burned," replied a fourth. "The projectile was nothing but an incandescent mass as it crossed the atmosphere." "What does it matter?" they exclaimed unanimously. "Living or dead, we must pull them out." But Captain Bloomsbury had assembled his officers, and, with their permission, was holding a council. They must decide upon something to be done immediately. The more hasty ones were for fishing up the projectile, a difficult operation, though not an impossible one. But the corvette had no proper machinery, which must be both fixed and powerful, so it was resolved that they should put in at the nearest port and give information to the gun club of the projectile's fall. This determination was unanimous. The choice of the port had to be discussed. The neighbouring coast had no anchorage on 27 degrees latitude. Higher up, above the peninsula of Monterey, stands the important town from which it takes its name. But, seated on the borders of a perfect desert, it was not connected with the interior by a network of telegraph wires, and electricity alone could spread these important news fast enough. Some degrees above opened the Bay of San Francisco. Through the capital of the gold country, communication would be easy with the heart of the Union, and in less than 2 days the Susquehanna, by putting on high pressure, could arrive in that port. She must therefore start at once. The fires were made up. They could set off immediately. 2,000 fathoms of line were still out, which Captain Bloomsbury, not wishing to lose precious time in hauling in, resolved to cut. "We will fasten the end to a buoy," said he, "and that buoy will show us the exact spot where the projectile fell." "Besides," replied Lieutenant Bronsfield, "we have our situation exact, 27 degrees 7 hours north latitude and 41 degrees 37 hours west longitude." "Well, Mr. Bloomsfield," replied the captain, "now, with your permission, we will have the line cut." A strong buoy, strengthened by a couple of spars, was thrown into the ocean. The end of the rope was carefully lashed to it, and left solely to the rise and fall of the billows. The buoy would not sensibly deviate from the spot. At this moment the engineer sent to inform the captain that the steam was up, and they could start, for which agreeable communication the captain thanked him. The course was then given north-northeast, and the corvette, wearing, steered at full steam direct for San Francisco. It was 3 in the morning. 450 miles to cross. It was nothing for a good vessel like the Susquehanna. In 36 hours she had covered that distance, and on the 14th of December, at 27 minutes past 1 at night, she entered the Bay of San Francisco. At the sight of a ship of the National Navy arriving at full speed, with her bowsprit broken, public curiosity was greatly aroused. A dense crowd soon assembled on the quay, waiting for them to disembark. After casting anchor, Captain Bloomsbury and Lieutenant Bromsfield entered an 8-parred cutter, which soon brought them to land. They jumped on to the quay. "The telegraph?" they asked, without answering one of the 1,000 questions addressed to them. The officer of the port conducted them to the telegraph office through a concourse of spectators. Bloomsbury and Bronsfield entered, while the crowd crushed each other at the door. Some minutes later, a 4-fold telegram was sent out. The first to the Naval Secretary at Washington, the second to the Vice President of the Gun Club, Baltimore, the third to Honorable J.T. Maston, Long's Peak, Rocky Mountains, and the fourth to the Sub-Director of the Cambridge Observatory, Massachusetts. It was worded as follows: "In 20 degrees 7 hours north latitude and 41 degrees 37 hours west longitude, on the 12th of December, at 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, the projectile of the Columbiad fell into the Pacific. Send instructions. Bloomsbury, Commander, Susquehanna." 5 minutes afterward, the whole town of San Francisco learned the news. Before 6 in the evening, the different states of the Union had heard the great catastrophe, and after midnight, by the cable, the whole of Europe knew the result of the great American experiment. We will not attempt to picture the effect produced on the entire world by that unexpected denouement. On receipt of the telegram, the naval secretary telegraphed to the Susquehanna to wait in the bay of San Francisco without extinguishing her fires. Day and night she must be ready to put to sea. The Cambridge Observatory called a special meeting, and, with that composure which distinguishes learned bodies in general, peacefully discussed the scientific bearings of the question. At the gun club there was an explosion. All the gunners were assembled. Vice President, the Honourable Wilcome, was in the act of reading the premature dispatch, in which J.T. Maston and Belfast announced that the projectile had just been seen in the gigantic reflector of Long's Peak, and also it was held by lunar attraction, and was playing the part of under-satellite to the lunar world. We know the truth on that point. But on the arrival of Bloomsbury's dispatch, so decidedly contradicting J.T. Maston's telegram, two parties were formed in the bosom of the Gun Club. On one side were those who admitted the fall of the projectile, and consequently the return of the travellers. On the other, those who believed in the observations of Long's Peak, concluded that the commander of the Susquehanna had made a mistake. To the latter, the pretended projectile was nothing but a meteor, a shooting globe, which in its fall had smashed the bows of the corvette. It was difficult to answer this argument, for the speed with which it was animated must have made observation very difficult. The commander of the Susquehanna and her officers might have made a mistake, in all good faith. One argument, however, was in their favour, namely, that if the projectile had fallen on Earth, its place of meeting with the terrestrial globe could only take place on this 27° north latitude, and, taking into consideration the time that had elapsed, and the rotary motion of the Earth, between the 41° and the 42° of west longitude. In any case, it was decided in the Gun Club that Bloomsbury brothers, Bilsby and Major Elphinstone, should go straight to San Francisco and consult as to the means of raising the projectile from the depths of the ocean. These devoted men set off at once, and the railroad, which will soon cross the whole of Central America, took them as far as St. Louis, where the swift mail coaches awaited them. Almost at the same moment in which the Secretary of Marine, the Vice President of the Gun Club, and the Subdirector of the Observatory received the dispatch from San Francisco, the Honourable J.T. Maston was undergoing the greatest excitement he had ever experienced in his life, an excitement which even the bursting of his pet gun, which had more than once nearly cost him his life, had not caused him. We may remember that the Secretary of the Gun Club had started soon after the projectile, and almost as quickly, for the station on Long's Peak in the Rocky Mountains, J. Belfast, director of the Cambridge Observatory, accompanying him. Arrived there, the two friends had installed themselves at once, never quitting the summit of their enormous telescope. We know that this gigantic instrument had been set up according to the reflecting system, called the English front view. This arrangement subjected all objects to but one reflection, making the view consequently much clearer. The result was that, when they were taking observation, J.T. Maston and Belfast were placed in the upper part of the instrument, and not in the lower, which they reached by a circular staircase, a masterpiece of lightness, while below them opened a metal well terminated by the metallic mirror, which measured 280 feet in depth. It was on a narrow platform placed above the telescope that the two savants passed their existence, execrating the day which hid the moon from their eyes, and the clouds which obstinately veiled her during the night. What then was their delight when, after some days of waiting, on the night of the 5th of December, they saw the vehicle which was bearing their friends into space. To this delight succeeded a great deception, when, trusting to a cursory observation, they launched their first telegram to the world. erroneously affirming that the projectile had become a satellite of the moon, gravitating in an immutable orbit. From that moment it had never shown itself to their eyes. A disappearance all the more easily explained, as it was then passing behind the moon's invisible disk. But when it was time for it to reappear on the visible disk, one may imagine the impatience of the fuming J.T. Maston and his not less impatient companion. Each minute of the night they thought they saw the projectile once more, and they did not see it. Hence constant discussions and violent disputes between them, Belfast affirming that the projectile could not be seen, J.T. Maston maintaining that it had put his eyes out. "It is the projectile," repeated J.T. Maston. "No," answered Belfast, "it is an avalanche detached from a lunar mountain." "Well, we shall see it tomorrow." "No, we shall not see it any more. It is carried into space." "Yes." "No." And at these moments, when contradictions rained like hail, the well-known irritability of the Secretary of the Gun Club constituted a permanent danger for the Honourable Belfast. The existence of these two together would soon have become impossible, but an unforeseen event cut short their everlasting discussions. During the night from the 14th to the 15th of December, the two irreconcilable friends were busy observing the lunar disk, J.T. Maston abusing the learned Belfast as usual, who was by his side, the Secretary of the Gun Club maintaining for the 1000th time that he had just seen the projectile, and adding that he could see Nicholl and Ardan's face looking through one of the scuttles, at the same time enforcing his argument by a series of gestures which his formidable hook rendered very unpleasant. At this moment Belfast's servant appeared on the platform. It was 10 at night, and gave him a dispatch. It was the commander of the Susquehanna's telegram. Belfast tore the envelope and read, and uttered a cry. "What?" said J.T. Maston. "The projectile." "Well?" "Has fallen to the earth." Another cry, this time a perfect howl, answered him. He turned toward J.T. Maston. The unfortunate man, imprudently leaning over the metal tube, had disappeared in the immense telescope. A fall of 280 feet. Belfast, dismayed, rushed to the orifice of the reflector. He breathed. J.T. Maston, caught by his metal hook, was holding on by one of the rings which bound the telescope together, uttering fearful cries. Belfast called. Help was brought. Tackle was let down, and they hoisted up, not without some trouble, the imprudent Secretary of the Gun Club. He reappeared at the upper orifice without hurt. "Ah," said he, "if I had broken the mirror—" "You would have paid for it," replied Belfast severely. "And that cursed projectile has fallen?" asked J.T. Maston. "Into the Pacific." "Let us go." A quarter of an hour after, the two savants were descending the declivity of the Rocky Mountains, and 2 days after, at the same time as their friends of the Gun Club, they arrived at San Francisco, having killed 5 horses on the road. Elphinstone, the brothers Bloomsbury, and Bilsby rushed towards them on their arrival. "What shall we do?" they exclaimed. "Fish up the projectile," replied J.T. Maston, "and the sooner the better." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 22. Recovered from the sea. The spot where the projectile sank under the waves was exactly known, but the machinery to grasp it and bring it to the surface of the ocean was still wanting. It must first be invented, then made. American engineers could not be troubled with such trifles. The grappling irons once fixed, by their help they were sure to raise it in spite of its weight, which was lessened by the density of the liquid in which it was plunged. But fishing up the projectile was not the only thing to be thought of. They must act promptly, in the interest of the travellers. No one doubted that they were still living. "Yes," repeated J.T. Maston incessantly, whose confidence gained over everybody. "Our friends are clever people, and they cannot have fallen like simpletons. They are alive, quite alive, but we must make haste if we wish to find them so. Food and water do not trouble me, they have enough for a long while, but air, air, that is what they will soon want, so quick, quick." And they did go quick. They fitted up the Susquehanna for her new destination. Her powerful machinery was brought to bear upon the hauling chains. The aluminum projectile only weighed 19,250 pounds, a weight very inferior to that of the transatlantic cable, which had been drawn up under similar conditions. The only difficulty was in fishing up a cylindro-conical projectile, the walls of which were so smooth as to offer no hold for the hooks. On that account, Engineer Murchison hastened to San Francisco, and had some enormous grappling irons fixed on an automatic system, which would never let the projectile go if it once succeeded in seizing it in its powerful claws. Diving dresses were also prepared, which through this impervious covering allowed the divers to observe the bottom of the sea. He also had put on board an apparatus of compressed air very cleverly designed. There were perfect chambers pierced with scuttles, which, with water let into certain compartments, could draw it down to great depths. These apparatuses were at San Francisco, where they had been used in the construction of a submarine breakwater, and very fortunately it was so, for there was no time to construct any. But, in spite of the perfection of the machinery, in spite of the ingenuity of the savants entrusted with the use of them, the success of the operation was far from being certain. How great were the chances against them, the projectile being 20,000 feet under the water! And if even it was brought to the surface, how would the travellers have borne the terrible shock which 20,000 feet of water had perhaps not sufficiently broken? At any rate, they must act quickly. J.T. Maston hurried the workmen day and night. He was ready to don the diving dress himself, or try the air apparatus in order to reconnoitre the situation of his courageous friends. But in spite of all the diligence displayed in preparing the different engines, in spite of the considerable sum placed at the disposal of the Gun Club by the government of the Union, 5 long days, 5 centuries, elapsed before the preparations were complete. During this time public opinion was excited to the highest pitch. Telegrams were exchanged incessantly throughout the entire world by means of wires and electric cables. The saving of Barbicane, Nicholl, and Ardan was an international affair. Everyone who had subscribed to the Gun Club was directly interested in the welfare of the travellers. At length the hauling chains, the air chambers, and the automatic grappling irons were put on board. J.T. Maston, Engineer Murchison, and the delegates of the Gun Club were already in their cabins. They had but to start, which they did on the 21st of December at 8 o'clock at night. The corvette meeting with a beautiful sea, a northwesterly wind, and rather sharp cold. The whole population of San Francisco was gathered on the quay, greatly excited but silent, reserving their hurrahs for the return. Steam was fully up, and the screw of the Susquehanna carried them briskly out of the bay. It is needless to relate the conversations on board between the officers, sailors, and passengers. All these men had but one thought. All these hearts beat under the same emotion. While they were hastening to help them, what were Barbicane and his companions doing? What had become of them? Were they able to attempt any bold maneuver to regain their liberty? None could say. The truth is that every attempt must have failed. Immersed nearly 4 miles under the ocean, this metal prison defied every effort of its prisoners. On the 23rd inst, at 8 in the morning, after a rapid passage, the Susquehanna was due at the fatal spot. They must wait till 12 to take the reckoning exactly. The buoy to which the surrounding line had been lashed had not yet been recognized. At 12, Captain Bloomsbury, assisted by his officers who superintended the observations, took the reckoning in the presence of the delegates of the Gun Club. Then there was a moment of anxiety. Her position decided, the Susquehanna was found to be some minutes westward of the spot where the projectile had disappeared beneath the waves. The ship's course was then changed so as to reach this exact point. At 47 minutes past 12, they reached the buoy. It was in perfect condition, and must have shifted but little. "At last!" exclaimed J.T. Maston. "Shall we begin?" asked Captain Bloomsbury. "Without losing a second." Every precaution was taken to keep the corvette almost completely motionless. Before trying to seize the projectile, Engineer Murchison wanted to find its exact position at the bottom of the ocean. The submarine apparatus destined for this expedition was supplied with air. The working of these engines was not without danger, for at 20,000 feet below the surface of the water, and under such great pressure, they were exposed to fracture, the consequences of which would be dreadful. J.T. Maston, the brothers Bloomsbury, and Engineer Murchison, without heeding these dangers, took their places in the air chamber. The commander, posted on his bridge, superintended the operation, ready to stop or haul in the chains on the slightest signal. The screw had been shipped, and the whole power of the machinery collected on the capstan would have quickly drawn the apparatus on board. The descent began at 25 minutes past 1 at night, and the chamber drawn under by the reservoirs full of water disappeared from the surface of the ocean. The emotion of the officers and sailors on board was now divided between the prisoners in the projectile and the prisoners in the submarine apparatus. As to the latter, they forgot themselves, and glued to the windows of the scuttles, attentively watched the liquid mass through which they were passing. The descent was rapid. At 17 minutes past 2, J.T. Maston and his companions had reached the bottom of the Pacific, but they saw nothing but an arid desert, no longer animated by either fauna or flora. By the light of their lamps, furnished with powerful reflectors, they could see the dark beds of the ocean for a considerable extent of view, but the projectile was nowhere to be seen. The impatience of these bold divers cannot be described, and having an electrical communication with the corvette, they made a signal already agreed upon, and for the space of a mile the Susquehanna moved their chamber along some yards above the bottom. Thus they explored the whole submarine plain, deceived at every turn by optical illusions which almost broke their hearts. Here a rock, there a projection from the ground, seemed to be the much sought-for projectile. But their mistake was soon discovered, and they were in despair. "But where are they? Where are they?" cried J.T. Maston, and the poor man called loudly upon Nicholl, Barbicane, and Nicholl and Ardan, as if his unfortunate friends could either hear or answer him through such an impenetrable medium. The search continued under these conditions until the vitiated air compelled the divers to ascend. The hauling in began about 6 in the evening, and was not ended before midnight. "Tomorrow," said J.T. Maston as he set foot on the bridge of the corvette. "Yes," answered Captain Bloomsbury. "And on another spot?" "Yes." J.T. Maston did not doubt of their final success, but his companions, no longer upheld by the excitement of the first hours, understood all the difficulty of the enterprise. What seemed easy at San Francisco seemed here in the wide ocean almost impossible. The chances of success diminished in rapid proportion, and it was from chance alone that the meeting with the projectile might be expected. The next day, the 24th, in spite of the fatigue of the previous day, the operation was renewed. The corvette advanced some minutes to westward, and the apparatus, provided with air, bore the same explorers to the depth of the ocean. The whole day passed in fruitless research. The bed of the sea was a desert. The 25th brought no result, nor the 26th. It was disheartening. They thought of those unfortunates shut up in the projectile for 26 days. Perhaps at that moment they were experiencing the first approach of suffocation. That is, if they had escaped the dangers of their fall. The air was spent, and doubtless with the air all their morale. The air possibly, answered J.T. Maston resolutely, but their morale never. On the 28th, after 2 more days of search, all hope was gone. This projectile was but an atom in the immensity of the ocean. They must give up all idea of finding it. But J.T. Maston would not hear of going away. He would not abandon the place without at least discovering the tomb of his friends. But Commander Bloomsbury could no longer persist, and in spite of the exclamations of the worthy secretary, was obliged to give the order to sail. On the 29th of December, at 9 a.m., the Susquehanna, heading northeast, resumed her course to the Bay of San Francisco. It was 10 in the morning. The corvette was under half steam, as it was regretting to leave the spot where the catastrophe had taken place, when a sailor, perched on the main-top gallant crosstrees, watching the sea, cried suddenly, "A boy on the lee bow!" The officers looked in the direction indicated, and by the help of their glasses saw that the object signalled had the appearance of one of those buoys which are used to mark the passage of bays or rivers. But, singularly to say, a flag floating on the wind surmounted its cone, which emerged 5 or 6 feet out of the water. This buoy shone under the rays of the sun, as if it had been made of plates of silver. Commander Bloomsbury, J.T. Maston, and the delegates of the gun club were mounted on the bridge, examining this object straying at random on the waves. All looked with feverish anxiety, but in silence. None dared give expression to the thoughts which came to the minds of all. The corvette approached to within 2 cables' length of the object. A shudder ran through the whole crew. That flag was the American flag. At this moment a perfect howling was heard. It was the brave J.T. Maston, who had just fallen all in a heap, forgetting, on the one hand, that his right arm had been replaced by an iron hook, and on the other, that a simple gutta-percha cap covered his brain-box. He had given himself a formidable blow. They hurried toward him, picked him up, restored him to life. And what were his first words? "Ah, trebly brutes, quadruply idiots, quintuply boobies that we are! What is it?" exclaimed every one around him. "What is it? Come, speak!" "It is, simpletons," howled the terrible secretary, "it is that the projectile only weighs 19,250 pounds. Well? And that it displaces 28 tons, or, in other words, 56,000 pounds, and that consequently it floats." Ah, what stress the worthy man had laid on the verb float! And it was true. All these savants had forgotten this fundamental law, namely, that on account of its specific lightness, the projectile, after having been drawn by its full fall to the greatest depths of the ocean, must naturally return to the surface. And now it was floating quietly at the mercy of the waves. The boats were put to sea. J.T. Maston and his friends had rushed into them. Excitement was at its height. Every heart beat loudly while they advanced to the projectile. What did it contain, living or dead? Living, yes, living, at least, unless death had struck Barbicane and his 2 friends since they had hoisted the flag. Profound silence reigned on the boats. All were breathless. Eyes no longer saw. One of the scuttles of the projectile was open. Some pieces of glass remained in the frame, showing that it had been broken. This scuttle was actually 5 feet above the water. A boat came alongside that of J.T. Maston, and J.T. Maston rushed to the broken window. At that moment they heard a clear and merry voice, the one of Nicholl and Ardan, exclaiming in an accent of triumph, "Whitehall, Barbicane, Whitehall!" Barbicane, Nicholl and Ardan, and Nicholl were playing at dominoes. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Round the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Ann Walden. Round the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. The End. We may remember the intense sympathy which had accompanied the travelers on their departure. If at the beginning of the enterprise they had excited such emotion both in the Old and New World, with what enthusiasm would they be received on their return? The millions of spectators which had beset the peninsula of Florida, would they not rush to meet these sublime adventurers? Those legions of strangers, hurrying from all parts of the globe toward the American shores, would they leave the Union without having seen Barbicane, Nicholl, and Michel Ardan? No, and the ardent passion of the public was bound to respond worthily to the greatness of the enterprise. Human creatures who had left the terrestrial sphere and returned after this strange voyage into celestial space could not fail to be received as the prophet Elias would be if he came back to earth. To see them first, and then to hear them, such was the universal longing. Barbicane, Michel Ardan, Nicholl, and the delegates of the Gun Club, returning without delay to Baltimore, were received with indescribable enthusiasm. The notes of President Barbicane's voyage were ready to be given to the public. The New York Herald bought the manuscript at a price not yet known, but which must have been very high. Indeed, during the publication of A Journey to the Moon, the sale of this paper amounted to 5 millions of copies. 3 days after the return of the travelers to the earth, the slightest detail of their expedition was known. There remained nothing more but to see the heroes of this superhuman enterprise. The expedition of Barbicane and his friends round the moon had enabled them to correct the many admitted theories regarding the terrestrial satellite. These savants had observed deviation, and under particular circumstances. They knew what systems should be rejected, what retained with regard to the formation of that orb, its origin, its habitability. Its past, present, and future had even given up their last secrets. Who could advance objections against conscientious observers who at less than 24 miles distance had marked that curious mountain of Tycho, the strangest system of lunar orography? How answer those savants whose sight had penetrated the abyss of Pluto's circle? How contradict those bold ones whom the chances of their enterprise had borne over that invisible face of the disk, which no human eye until then had ever seen? It was now their turn to impose some limit on that selenographic science, which had reconstructed the lunar world as Cuvier did the skeleton of a fossil, and say, "The moon was this, a habitable world, inhabited before the earth. The moon is that, a world uninhabitable, and now uninhabited." To celebrate the return of its most illustrious member and his 2 companions, the Gun Club decided upon giving a banquet, but a banquet worthy of the conquerors, worthy of the American people, and under such conditions that all the inhabitants of the Union could directly take part in it. All the head lines of railroads in the States were joined by flying rails, and on all the platforms, lined with the same flags and decorated with the same ornaments, were tables laid and all served alike. At certain hours, successively calculated, marked by electric clocks which beat the seconds at the same time, the population were invited to take their places at the banquet tables. For 4 days, from the 5th to the 9th of January, the trains were stopped as they are on Sundays on the railways of the United States, and every road was open. One engine only at full speed, drawing a triumphal carriage, had the right of traveling for those 4 days on the railroads of the United States. The engine was manned by a driver and a stoker, and bore, by special favor, the Honorable J.T. Maston, Secretary of the Gun Club. The carriage was reserved for President Barbicane, Colonel Nicholl, and Michel Ardan. At the whistle of the driver, amid the hurrahs and all the admiring vociferations of the American language, the train left the platform of Baltimore. It traveled at a speed of 160 miles in the hour. But what was this speed compared with that which had carried the 3 heroes from the mouth of the Columbiad? Thus they sped from one town to the other, finding whole populations at table on their road, saluting them with the same acclamations, lavishing the same bravos. They traveled in this way through the east of the Union, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, the north and west by New York, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, returning to the south by Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. They went to the southeast by Alabama and Florida, going up by Georgia and the Carolinas, visiting the center by Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and Indiana, and, after quitting the Washington station, re-entered Baltimore, where for 4 days one would have thought that the United States of America were seated at one immense banquet, saluting them simultaneously with the same hurrahs. The apotheosis was worthy of these 3 heroes whom fable would have placed in the rank of demigods. And now, will this attempt, unprecedented in the annals of travels, lead to any practical result? Will direct communication with the moon ever be established? Will they ever lay the foundation of a traveling service through the solar world? Will they go from one planet to another, from Jupiter to Mercury, and after a while from one star to another, from the polar to Sirius? Will this means of locomotion allow us to visit those suns which swarm in the firmament? To such questions no answer can be given. But knowing the bold ingenuity of the Anglo-Saxon race, no one would be astonished if the Americans seek to make some use of President Barbicane's attempt. Thus, some time after the return of the travelers, the public received with marked favor the announcement of a company, limited, with a capital of $100 million, divided into 100,000 shares of $1,000 each, under the name of the National Company of Interstellary Communication. President, Barbicane. Vice President, Captain Nicholl. Secretary, J.T. Maston. Director of Movements, Michel Ardan. And as it is part of the American temperament to foresee everything in business, even failure, the Honorable Harry Trollope, Judge Commissioner, and Francis Drayton, Magistrate, were nominated beforehand. End of Chapter 23. This concludes Round the Moon by Jules Verne.